Welcome to episode 49 of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I'm Ashley Scott Myers, screenwriter and blogger over at sellingyourscreenplay.com. In this episode's main segment, I'm interviewing Corey Mandell. Corey is a screenwriter and a screenwriting teacher. He's got a ton of great actionable advice for writers at all levels, so stay tuned for that. If you find this episode valuable, please help me out by giving me a review in iTunes or leaving a comment on YouTube or retweeting the podcast on Twitter or liking it on Facebook. These social media shares really do help spread word about the podcast, so they are very much appreciated. Over on iTunes, I would like to thank Arj for leaving a nice review in iTunes. I really appreciate the nice comment. It's nice to know that the podcast is helping inspire other writers. Over on YouTube, thank you Stanford Crane and Martha Lugzak, who left me a nice comment on episode 47. I'm very close to having 500 subscribers to my channel. In fact, as I record this, I actually have 499. So if you use YouTube a lot, please consider subscribing to the channel. It should help push me past the 500 mark. On Facebook, I want to thank Ray Chen, Lou Agents, who liked episode 47, and thanks Josh Albert and Christian Dos Santos, who both liked the SYS Facebook page. You can find our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/sellingyourscreenplay. Our Facebook page is growing nicely, so please like it if you get a chance. A couple of quick notes. Any websites or links that I mentioned in the podcast can be found in my blog and the show notes. I also publish a transcript with every episode in case you'd rather read the show or look at something later on. If you find all the podcast, you can find all the podcast show notes at www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/podcast, and then just look for episode number 49. Also, if you want my free guide, How to Sell a Screenplay in 5 Weeks, you can pick that up by going to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. It's completely free. You just put in your email address and I'll send you a new lesson once per week for 5 weeks, along with a bunch of bonus lessons. I teach the whole process of how to sell your screenplay in that guide: how to write a professional logline and query letter, how to find agents, managers, and producers who are looking for material. It really is everything you need to know to sell your screenplay. Just go to sellingyourscreenplay.com/guide. So now let's get into the main segment. Today I'm talking with writer and screenwriting teacher Corey Mandell. Here is the interview. Welcome, Corey, to the Selling Your Screenplay podcast. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So to start out, I wonder if you can give us a quick overview of your career and kind of how you got into the entertainment industry.
So I went to film school at UCLA, and I was really fortunate to sell a pitch to Ridley Scott. And he hired me to write Metropolis, and Ridley Scott was one of my heroes, so it's kind of like a dream come true. I literally was in film school one day and being flown to London and working with Ridley and his team the next day.
And that was just literally your big break, and then you were off to the races. You got an agent from there, a manager.
I actually got an agent before that. That's how I got that. So I guess to back up a little bit, I had written a script. This was in the late 90s. And so Meg Ryan got attached, and then Chris Mandell to direct. And it didn't actually end up selling. As my agent said, it got about as close to selling as you can get without actually selling. But it got me meetings, and I had an idea for a story. And my agent said, what's your dream list? Who would you most want to sell this to? And the first person was Ridley Scott. And that was my first meeting. And Ridley bought it in the room. So it was like I thought I was going to wake up, and it was a dream, literally.
So let's back it up even further. So you said you're at UCLA. Were you a graduate student or you were an undergraduate?
A graduate, MFA. Actually, I was in the producers program and decided I wanted to be a screenwriter, not a producer. So I switched into taking the screenwriting classes.
Okay, so then while you're in there, you wrote this script that Meg Ryan got attached to, and what number, like how many had you written scripts before that? Were you on this track to be a screenwriter?
So the official PR answer is that was the very first script I wrote, and I wrote it in a weekend, and I'm just natural. The reality, it was about the fourth script that I wrote. I was interning for a manager, and so here's the truth of it. The truth of it was, I'm in film school, and it's towards the end of the second year, and I'm in a screenwriting group, and we've all decided we're going to be completely honest to each other. We're not going to blow smoke up each other's pants or skirts. And there's a couple of professional working writers in the group, and I'd written a script, and they'd given me feedback, and I'd done a bunch of rewriting, and it got to the point where they all said, "This is amazing. This will sell. This is awesome." And just to verify, I went to a professor that I really trusted at UCLA, who had a lot of very famous writers had started out in his class. And I gave him the script. And he read it, and he said, this will sell. This will get you an agent. This is one of the best scripts I've ever read. So I was interning for a manager. He wasn't my manager. And really, as a favor, I gave him the script to read. As a favor. That was my intent. And so he read it, and we met. I'll never forget. He said, it's a good, rough first draft, but you don't want to show anyone in the industry. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, it's not good enough. And I said, well, did I tell you what my screenwriting group said? Did I tell you what my professor said? And he said, they're not in the business of breaking writers into the business. I am. I know how good things have to be. This will hurt you. It won't help you. And he did something that I'm forever grateful for. He said, I can tell you're not sure if you want to believe me. So here's what I suggest you do. Hire studio readers under the table. Actual studio readers, not consultants, actual studio readers. Pay them and say, if this script came across your desk, write the actual coverage you would write. And I didn't have the money to do it, but I did it. I hired 3. And as you know, when the coverage comes back, there's lots of things, but for the writer, it says recommend, consider, or pass. All 3 coverages came back with pass. And it was just like body blows. It really, hurt. And so I went to the writer, the manager, and I said, can you help me? And he said, yeah, he goes, you have some inherent strengths. You have inherent weaknesses. You don't even know what these weaknesses are. You don't know what you don't know. And I can help you turn those weaknesses into strengths. But it's going to take time, and I'm only going to do it if you're in it for the long run. I said yes. And so he worked with me for a year and a half. And at the end of that year and a half, he said, I now think you're ready. I'll pay for the coverages. And the coverages came back, recommend, recommend, recommend. And within a few weeks, I had an agent, and within a few weeks, I had the Ridley Scott deal. So the PR story, Ashley, is I was in film school. I was in the producer's program. I took a screenwriting class. I wrote the script. Bam, I have a career. Mm-hmm. That's a story I would tell people in the industry because they believe in this sort of natural talent. You have it or you don't. But for your listeners, because the biggest mistake writers make is going out to the marketplace before they're ready. Mm-hmm. And I would have made that mistake if not for this manager. So it was a year and a half of intense training and learning before I got to the script that got me an agent, that got me the Ridley Scott deal.
Mm-hmm. So was it the same script? You had this script that you had been working on. Did this manager, you just rewrote this script for a year and a half and then ended up with something, or was it different scripts over that period?
Correct. The first one, correct.
Correct. The same script.
Yeah, over and over and over. I mean, honestly, if I knew what it was going to take and how hard it was going to be to work with him, I don't know if I would have done it. I mean, it was long, hard, and grueling, but that was my education. Unfortunately, you just don't get that education MFA program. So That was my education. And then I was really fortunate because Ridley and his team took me under their wing, and they helped teach me and develop stuff. When I was with Ridley, my biggest fear, so here I am, I was in film school, a total nobody. The next day I'm in London. I'm still a nobody, but I'm working for Ridley Scott, who's one of my heroes. And I'm terrified that they're going to realize that they made a mistake, that they hired a nobody who doesn't know anything. And like the second or third night we're at dinner, and one of the producers leans across the table and says, you go to film school. And I go, yes, I do, because I have something I can hang my hat on, right? And he said, so you know the 3-act structure, 17-page inciting incident, midpoint structure. And I'm like, yes, I do. And he said, if you tried, I don't know if we're allowed to use profanity, so I will do this without profanity on this podcast. But he said, if you try to write the script to that BS formula, I will fire you so fast your head will spin, and I'll hire a real writer. And I actually laughed because I just thought he was joking. And he just looked at me in a very calm British accent. This was Ridley's producer. And he said, I am not joking. And I'm like, I kind of looked at my watch, and I'm like, okay, so my career has lasted 2 days and 17 minutes because it's over. And they taught me organic story structure. And then Ridley committed to making Metropolis. It didn't ultimately happen. I'll spare you the gory details, but it was the front page of Variety that Ridley was going to make Metropolis. And he actually mentioned me by name on the front page of Variety and said very complimentary things about the script. So what I'm sure your listeners already know this, but obviously, if you write something and Ridley Scott makes it, that's a great way to launch your career. Mm-hmm. Second best is write something and Ridley mentions your name and the script on the front page of Variety in a complimentary way. So at that point, I became the guy in town and the really hot writer for 6.5 minutes. And the next project I wrote was for Wolfgang Peterson, and they also taught me a lot of stuff. So I was really fortunate to launch my career early, and I was really fortunate to work for really great people who helped me become a better writer.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad I dug into that because that's a great answer. I think it's really worth noting that, as you said, you're in this writers group with professional writers. You go to UCLA, which is the top film school in the country, and one of your professors says, this thing is awesome. And the man on the street actually says, no, it's not going to work. And that is then empirically, verified by sending it out to the readers and getting these passes, because we're not even talking about your mom and your brother telling you
right.
that this thing is ready to go. These are actual people that have some credentials, and they're telling you, and yet it still was not. So I think that's a great story and a great lesson for people at home.
Quickly jump in. I just yesterday had lunch with a manager, and he said his biggest role when he signs someone is to be the protector of the writer, because he said writers are always in a rush to launch a career, and the biggest mistake is to go out when you're not ready, because you only get one first impression. And he said the clients that are the hardest are the ones who have friends who are professional writers, because their friends are telling them they're ready. And so why wouldn't you believe that when working writers are telling you you're ready? And the manager says it's a hard struggle, and I don't win all of the struggles, to tell that writer you're not where you need to be. And he goes, sometimes I have to let clients go. He goes, I love signing writers that don't have friends in the industry, because they don't get that. And, I teach screenwriting, and I know we'll get to that. And it's such a struggle. And I understand how people, they work really hard and they want to be verified, and they want to have a career, and they want to know they're not wasting their time. But yeah, it is such a big mistake to go out before you're ready.
Okay, so let's go ahead and maybe take it a step back. Before we got on the interview, we were emailing back and forth, and one of the things you said that, you see a lot of people trying to break into the industry doing it the wrong way, and I think this is a good segue. So let's talk about that. What are some of the mistakes you see people making when they're trying to break in, and then, what are some of the things that they should be doing?
Great. Well, the biggest one we've already covered, is going out before you're ready. And I always bring in agents and managers to my UCLA classes, and they say, single biggest mistake. I'm sure your listeners know this. Every time you show your script to someone in the industry, it gets covered. And that coverage goes into a database that they all share. So if you go out before you're ready and burn your bridges at a production company, the mistake isn't localized, it's globalized, because any other production company, when you try to submit a script or get a manager to read your script, they can access that coverage. So it's like going to an interview drunk with a misspelling resume, and that person, that HR person, has a database where all HR people can access. So when you're trying to get another interview at another company, it's really difficult. Okay, so that's the single biggest mistake. I think the second biggest mistake is, writers really want to get an agent, and that's smart. You obviously, and I know your listeners know this, you need an agent. An agent is the one who's going to sell your material. An agent is the one who's going to get you in the right rooms with the right people. And most importantly, an agent gives you what you most need, which is credibility. Because everyone is so busy out there. If you have a script and you want a producer or a studio executive or a network executive or someone to read it, they got to get up at 6 or 7 in the morning to read it. Nobody wants to do that. And if you don't have an agent, they're just going to assume that you're not good enough to get an agent. And I know there's people out there that say, you could be an amazing writer and not have an agent. And that is possible, but from an industry point of view, you're going to play the percentages. So an agent can get people to read your material. They take their credibility and transfer it to you. Okay, so everybody wants to get an agent. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, what does an agent want? And people understandably say, well, agents want money. So agents want clients who can make them money. That's true. But here's the mistake that writers make. Agents aren't thinking in the short term, they're thinking long run. Therefore, a lot of writers think, I need to get material that an agent can sell. Now, what is marketable material? Well, let me look at what the studios are making or the networks are making. They seem to be making a lot of somewhat formulaic, generic ripoffs of successful fare. They're taking The Hangover or whatever movie and they're doing their variation on it. So that's what I should be writing. I should be following these formulas, writing something that is my take on something that's fairly generic and well-traveled territory, because that's what the studios are making. And that's when you talk to agents or managers, they will tell you, you cannot break into the business, or it's almost impossible to break in the business with those kinds of scripts. And so many people are doing it. They're trying to chase the marketplace. What agents always say is, we need writers who can write pitch perfect, authentic. And authentic is a script that only you could have written. Characters we've never seen before. A story we've never seen before. A sensibility, dialogue. It's just unique. And pitch perfect is a pitch perfect execution. So, original authentic characters, original authentic story, and a script we've never seen before. And writers will say, but most of those kinds of scripts never get made. Sure, you could be really lucky and be Alan Ball with American Beauty or Diablo Cody, which but that's a rare exception. And the answer is yes, you're right. You have to win the lottery for that script to sell and to get made. By the way, if you win that lottery, you have a really nice career right out of the gate. But sure, the statistics tell you that's not overly likely. But here's the thing. Most agents will say, I signed my clients off of scripts that I am almost definitely sure I cannot sell. And that seems weird for a lot of people. Why would they sign someone off a script they can't sell? Because if you can't sell it, you can't make money. The reason is, if an agent gets a script that is amazing, that no one's ever seen before, that script is going to get buzz. Everyone's going to talk about that script. Everyone's going to want to meet that writer. That writer breaks out of the noise of everyone who wants to break into the business. There's something unique and special about that writer. And what that agent wants is meetings and relationships all over town. Yeah, if you're super lucky, that script sells. If you're not super lucky, there's going to be a lot of people who want to work with that writer. And that's how you get a career. So, and I'm suddenly blanking on the gentleman's name, but the gentleman who wrote American Hustle, he broke into the business. Eric Singer broke into the business with a script called The Sky is Falling. Very unique original script, incredibly violent. It would make Quentin Tarantino blush. I mean, it was dark and violent. Everybody had to meet that writer. Everybody had to know who this guy was. Nobody bought that script. Nobody's going to make that script. It's just too out there. But everyone met him. Everybody wanted to work with him. And he was doing writing assignment after writing assignment, making nice six-figure income for many years. One of his movies got made, and then now American Hustle comes out, and he's now a big A-list writer. Mm-hmm. And a lot of my students have had the exact same experience. So from an agent's perspective, I'm sorry for droning on, you want to be, as an agent, you want to be in the incoming phone call business, not the outgoing phone call business. So if I'm an agent and I sign someone and they've written a nice, smart version of Game of Thrones or a nice, smart version of Transformers or The Hangover, I'm calling everyone saying, you haven't heard of this guy or gal, but they're great. You should get up at 6 in the morning and read their script. I'm telling you, they're great. And if I make enough of those phone calls, a bunch of people will read the script. And if they think the script is great, they'll eventually meet with that writer. But if you come to me, Ashley, and you've written a script, and it's just gone viral. That's what they want, scripts that go viral. All the development executives are passing it around saying, have you read Ashley's script? Have you read the script? It's flippin' unbelievable. And it's something I've never seen before. It's amazing. And they're all buzzing about it. Now executives are calling me and saying, how come I haven't met with Ashley? I'm like, he's booked in meetings for 3 weeks. And they're like, look, I will drop everything and have lunch with him tomorrow. You tell me when he's available. I'll make myself available. I got to meet with this guy. That's what I want as an agent. Because now I don't know if I'm going to sell your script and it's going to get made. We have to catch lightning in a bottle. Let's say it doesn't happen. Everybody in town wants to work with you. You have a shot to be an A-list writer. I don't know if it'll happen, but you have a shot at it. Where the guy or gal who writes the sort of formulaic, seen it a million times, I won't name the book, but this happens on this page, this happens on this page type mentality, even if they knocked it out of the park, which is impressive. Because it's not easy to write a great version of a formula. It's impressive, but nobody cares. Because anybody can do that. And there's a ton of writers who can do that who have credits. So why do I want to drop everything and meet with someone who wrote yet another version of something that was already created? It's just not that interesting to me. Mm-hmm. But so, I've been on these panels with these experts, and they'll say, you have to write this. You can't write drama. You can't write noir. You can't write Western. Like, I don't care how good it is. And yet my students and clients break in the business with those kinds of scripts. Usually don't sell, but they get meetings. They get relationships. They get jobs. And if they don't get a job out of those meetings, then the agent might say, okay, with your next script, maybe we take your sensibility and we bend it a little bit more towards a commercial fare. But because now you have all these fans. Because there's a big difference when you go out with a script and there are readers who read it versus fans, right? People who want to be in business with you and excited about you. So let's get those relationships. Then maybe we'll talk about you writing a more understandably commercial project. So I think the biggest mistake that writers are making is they're listening to all this advice about, hey, I've decoded these scripts. This is what happens on this page. This is how you put the script together. This is what readers look for. This is what you need to be writing. And when you talk to agents and managers, that's like the worst thing you can be doing. So that's also a really big mistake that writers are making.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great, and I've heard people try and explain sort of that situation of what the agent's looking for, and that was an excellent explanation. I want to touch on a couple of things. One of the things I've made my career at as a writer is sort of these low-budget genre films, and I actually am a big proponent of that being a great way to break in. And I mean, there is some track record of this. I think James Gunn, who just did Guardians of the Galaxy, one of his first movies was Romeo and Juliet, and so I just want to kind of clarify a couple of things. Like, you talk about this database that these people have. I mean, a lot of those movies that you see at AFM, it's like those producers are not piped into this database. What you're talking about here, getting the agent, getting into this database where the coverage goes around, that's purely at the studio level, correct? You wouldn't think that a lot of these more independent producers are connected with that kind of stuff.
I can't give you a definitive answer, but from what I know, the answer would be yes. You're right. Okay. Because
that's one of the things, and I just interviewed another director, and he's making these types of movies, and we go into that, and these producers at this independent level, we're talking movies that are $1 million and below, they're very open to any writer, agent, no agent, and so that's kind of one of the things that I've been proposing. And what you said is not, like, you and I don't disagree, and I just want to make that clear for the listeners that we're not disagreeing. What you're saying is absolutely correct, but it's much more geared towards the studio level and that A-level sort of writer, as opposed to
level.
Absolutely, TV, the network level, absolutely. But we're talking about more of the big corporate things. So let's get on to our next topic. I read an article on your blog, Why Writers Fail, and I thought this was an interesting topic that we could really dig into. You mentioned that there's a certain skill set, and I mean, this is it's an age-old question, sort of, is there some inherent talent? And really the question is not how much talent, it's how much can be learned, and it's a sliding scale. Is it a 90-10 split, a 50-50 split, or a 10-90 split? I mean, I think at some level you have to be intelligent, you have to be you have to have some inherent talent, but I think you break it down into some nice, manageable chunks. So let's go through that. Tell us what skill set you think the writer should really concentrate. And the one thing I really liked about your article was, it was like, before you just start, spewing out screenplays, make sure you understand these different skills, because they're going to be the building blocks of screenwriting. So let's talk about the skill set and how writers can acquire those skills.
Sure. So what I would say to this talent thing is, talent is repeatable skills. And those repeatable skills can be inherent and or learned. It doesn't matter. Talent is repeatable skills. And I believe, and I've been teaching screenwriting at UCLA and in private workshops and at the AFI screenwriting labs for a long time, like over a decade. And what I found is writers have inherent strengths, inherent weaknesses, and inherent blind spots, which are weaknesses they don't know they have. And when people write, they're trying to write the best possible script they can, obviously. But the thing is, if I'm trying to write the best possible script that I can, then knowingly or unknowingly, I write to my strengths and I try to hide my weaknesses, as I should. But over time, my strengths become stronger and my weaknesses become weaker. And that's why there's like a 99% failure rate out there, because too many writers keep writing and just making the same mistake. So in terms of skill sets, there's two I would say that are really vitally important. The one is, I'll call it creative integration, and I'll say that there's two modes to writing: conceptually and or intuitively. And most writers are wired to predominantly write conceptually or intuitively. So conceptual writers, they write outside in, and intuitive writers write inside out. What does that mean? When you work with a conceptual writer and you say, why did you write this? Like, what got you excited? It's almost always the idea, a theme, a world, something external that got them excited. An intuitive writer, it's almost always the character, or perhaps an emotion. Conceptual writers are people who would say, I have to figure out my story and outline it before. I have to figure out my story so I can go write it. And an intuitive writer would say, I have to write out my story so I can figure it out. It's a very different way of approaching the writing process. Now, with conceptual writers, they tend to have scripts that have lots of really interesting things happening, but the characters aren't compelling enough for them usually to launch a career. The puppets, the characters sort of feel like puppets, because to a conceptual writer, they invent the characters. They are in charge of the characters. The characters work for them, and they decide what the characters do or say in order to tell this really interesting story. So the characters almost never seem compelling or real enough. Now, when you work with an intuitive writer, they don't invent their characters. They discover them. They're real people. So when you hear Quentin Tarantino say, I just get my characters talking and I just follow them around like I'm a court reporter, that's a very intuitive way to write. The characters are real people. So they know what the characters would say or do. They just got to put the characters into a situation, and they know what will happen. But the problem is with intuitive writers is characters left to their own devices almost never end up telling a compelling story. And so intuitive writers have great characters and great dialogue, but they can't sustain or create strong enough stories. And they often feel, I've worked with writers and they have a sense of like almost shame about this and a sense of futility. Like, what's wrong with me? And what's wrong with them is they're trying to pound nails with a straw. They're using the wrong tool. The intuitive mind, all that it cares about is what feels authentic to you, what is interesting to you. It doesn't care what other people think. It's just what is most engaging to you in the moment. And conceptual writers are very concerned about what other people think. They're very concerned about story logic, causality, having interesting things happening. But the conceptual mind, again, invents and controls characters. So there's a lot of writers out there, as I'm sure you know, who are really great with character and dialogue. They just really struggle at plotting and structure. And there's writers who are really good at great big ideas, and interesting things happen and set pieces. A former student of mine who's now becoming a pretty big-time comedy director just complained to me that he's looking for his next project and he's been sent scripts. And he goes, I keep reading these scripts. They're really funny, great concept, great set pieces, but the characters feel like they were just stolen from other movies, and there's no heart to it. What's wrong with these writers? What's wrong with these writers is they're really funny conceptual people, and they can't access that intuitive side. So what I do when I work and train writers is I make them write to their weaknesses and hide their strengths. So if they're a conceptual writer, I train them how to turn that part off and how to work from a pure intuitive place. And what's difficult about it is both parts of your brain can't be active at the same time. So you really have to turn off your conceptual brain to access your intuitive brain. And for intuitive writers, it's the opposite. And it's really hard for writers to do this. And once they can do this, then I teach them how to integrate the two so that you ultimately can have great characters and great story, which is how you get to pitch perfect, authentic. It's transformative. It takes time. It isn't easy. Mm-hmm. So that's one skill set that I would say is
just
really
one
important.
One question I'd have about that is, do you think that there's any kind of a split? Like if you were to take the, a group of 100 A-list successful screenwriters, do you think is there any kind of a split where more of them come from the intuitive side versus the conceptual side? I mean, Charlie Kaufman comes to mind. It's like it seems like the screenwriters who get sort of that real critical acclaim are definitely more towards the intuitive side. side of these great zany characters, and then, over rewriting and rewriting, they're able to, pull those characters into an actual story. But do you think there's a split?
I think that you have some really crazy, hyper-intuitive writers like Charlie Kaufman who have managers or producers or directors in their life to put that conceptual skill set and discipline into the mix. And or you see a lot of writers who have gone through the integration process. So for instance, a lot of writers will say improv was so essential for my success. Improv is a great way of doing intuitive training. So a more conceptual writer who does a lot of improv is one way that you could get to creative integration. So I think that most A-list writers have done integration work, knowingly or unknowingly. And then you have certain ones like a Charlie Kaufman, who I don't know because I don't know Charlie Kaufman, but from what I can tell, I think he works with other people who help put that story discipline to his amazing intuitiveness, and it often turns out into really great, crazy movies. Mm-hmm. But I think, I know a lot of TV showrunners, and they are integrated. They can work from both sides because you have to. And most of the A-list writers that I know are integrated. But sure, so what I would tell someone is you want to become as integrated as possible, and you certainly don't want to be in a place where you're dependent on someone else for your success. So that's where integration comes in.
Okay. So maybe what's the next logical step is talking maybe about how that integration actually takes place?
Well, that would be like an entire podcast. I mean, that's really, okay. But we can move to another skill set if that's cool.
Okay. Yeah. No, let's do that.
Another skill set I would say is writing in compelling conflict. So, like when you read Neil Simon's rewrites, he talks about all of the plays that he wrote with these great characters and this great dialogue, but they weren't good enough. And he knew something was missing, but he didn't know what. And I was just talking in front of a couple hundred people at UCLA, and I asked them, raise your hand if you feel like something's missing in your writing, but you don't know what it is. And like almost everyone raises their hand, and it's a tough spot to be in. Neil Simon eventually went to his older brother, who was a successful writer at the time, and said, what's missing in my writing? And his older brother said, you don't write in compelling conflict. And he said, yes, I do. Of course I do. What is compelling conflict? And he said, my older brother taught me, and I suddenly understood what was missing. And then I realized that writing was creating compelling conflicts and then filling in the dialogue. And he's gone on to have a pretty good career. Mm-hmm. Aaron Sorkin and I share the same agent, and I've gotten a chance to sort of know him. And I've heard him a couple times say, so many new writers are so interested in designing the car and the features and the design. They never build an engine, so it doesn't go anywhere. Because I was trained to start with the engine. It's the grunt work. It's not sexy. When you have a strong engine, you build a car around it. That engine is compelling conflict. So
can you just define a little bit like what compelling conflict actually is?
Compelling conflict is conflict where we are externalizing the internal. There is efficient clarity. There is stakes that are meaningful to a reader. And the conflict supports the page count. We've all read scripts where it's really interesting and then it runs out of steam. So we're talking about organic escalations and a sense of sort of cohesion. And I could spend 20 minutes on each of those, which I know we don't have that time. Mm-hmm. But what I would like to say is I found that about 5% of people naturally write like this. So if I have 20 students, probably 1 or 2 naturally do this, and the others don't. And so most people don't. And if you don't write in compelling conflict, there's a couple of things that's going to be really bothersome that you probably won't know. One is when we write scripts, a movie plays in our head. And then when we give the scripts to other people to read, movies and characters play in their head. And we usually assume it's the same characters in the story. But if you actually do the job of asking the right questions to see what movie and characters other people are experiencing, writers would be shocked and appalled to see they spent so much time and passion writing this, and other people are seeing something different. And it's not a better version, it's a worse version. If you don't write in compelling conflict, no one else is going to see what you see. So, and I don't know if you do consultations or not, but I don't do them anymore, but I used to do a lot of consultations, and I would always ask the writer a bunch of questions to see how they saw their characters, why they cared about their characters, what was compelling about their characters. Same thing with story. I'd ask a lot of questions, half hour worth, to really experience what the writer experiences with their script. And then I would almost always say, man, what you are experiencing is so much stronger than what anybody else experiences when they read your script. Let me show you why and what to do about it. Mm-hmm. And it almost always comes down to compelling conflict. The second thing is, like, so many writers complain about second acts and how hard second acts are. Compelling conflict is the gasoline that creates and sustains narrative momentum. So if you're driving from LA to San Diego and you only have enough gas for halfway and your car stops in Dana Point's not the problem. It's not having enough gas. So not writing a compelling conflict is another reason why a lot of people think second acts are so hard. So it's a learnable skill set, and it's a really critical skill set.
I wonder if you could just grab a movie quickly that we all know and kind of just describe the compelling conflict in it.
Well, the thing is compelling conflict is comprised of all these different elements. So it'd be hard, it would just take a long time to sort of break down how all these elements. But here's an example that might help. So when I used to do script consults, I would ask the writer, who's your main character or characters? What's their main goal? What are they trying to accomplish? And if those goals weren't external and specific, I knew that story wasn't going to work as a movie. And half the writers have internal goals or goals that aren't external and specific. So, people will say, well, I'm doing a small character-driven film like Beasts of Southern Wild. I don't want to have external specific conflict. It's all about the human experience. And yes, what makes Beasts of Southern Wild so beautiful is the human experience, but it is contained within compelling conflict. So when you go and look at the characters like Wink and you say, what is his objective? His first objective is to convince everybody not to leave their community because the storm is coming. That's an external specific goal. Then an external specific goal is blowing up the levee. He then has an external specific goal of escaping the refugee camp. Now, the reason he has these goals is he's going to die. His daughter has no mother. The only thing she will have is this community. It's the only thing he knows. It's the only way of life, and it's about to get wiped out. So the stakes are not just his entire community and everything he's ever known is going to be destroyed, but his daughter will have nothing. So we have goals and we have stakes. And then Hush Puppy's goal is to find her mother. These are external specific goals. They're stakes. It's written with the same techniques as The Fugitive is, or, a straight action movie. But in Beasts of Southern Wild, that conflict contains the human experience, and that's why we go to see that movie. Also, another example would be people write a script about a guy who's going through a midlife crisis, and he wants to feel young, he wants to feel alive, and he just wants to get meaning in his life. That script's not going to work. Now, if you take all of that and you can externalize it into conflict, so you have a character whose external specific goal is to have sex with his 16-year-old daughter's best friend, as Lester Burnham. Now, not an appropriate goal, and I'm pretty sure not a legal goal, but it's an external specific goal built off of stakes. And when I talk about that to a lot of writers, they're like, yeah, that makes so much sense, but they don't write that way. There's one or two or three pieces missing in their writing, and there's reasons why, which kind of goes beyond this podcast. But I would say learning to write in compelling conflict. When I teach at UCLA and in my private workshops, that's the first thing that I teach people. That's the foundational skill. Until they can write in compelling conflict, I don't think anything else matters because they're just not going to succeed.
So let's move on quickly to some of these other things. One of the other points was the writing process. Maybe we could touch on that briefly.
Yeah, I think I talked enough that I can do that quickly, which is we all have a process in which we create our product. When you start writing, do you outline? Do you do character work? What do you do? Do you evaluate your work while you write? How do you rewrite? Like, all of that's your process, and it creates your product. And most people, the process they use doesn't allow them to create their best product. The process they use is a very comfortable process that plays to their strengths and hides their weaknesses. So I work with writers and I give them different processes, and we will track product outcome to process to figure out what's their best process. And more often than not, the process that they most don't want to try, the one that they would never do on their own, creates their best product. Sometimes a person's default natural process does create their best product. It is possible, but it's unlikely. So process work is literally experimenting with different processes to see what kind of product quality of product that it creates to figure out your best process.
Perfect. And an example with that's like a lot of people, they don't like to use note cards. They like just start writing the script. And you're saying take a step back and force them to do note cards before they write. That would be sort of the function of the process.
Well, that might be one process, but often what I'll do is I'll work with writers who always outline and figure it out, and then I'll make them start from a much more intuitive place. Or I'll take an intuitive and I'll make there's a lot of variations to process. It's not quite that clear cut, but that certainly, I think, gives a good example. But there's a lot of variations on process, and I'll lead people through kind of a spectrum of processes to help figure out. Because here's the thing, when I work with someone, I'm not smart enough to know what their best process is going to be, and they don't know either. No one knows until you experiment and try different processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. So touch on these last couple of points in this toolbox. You mentioned structure. Maybe we could talk briefly about that.
Yeah. So again, I think most writers have sort of two choices. They either follow all these rules that they've been taught and follow these paradigms. And for reasons I've already said, agents and managers are now sending me people to my workshops, and they're saying, this writer's got great character and dialogue, but they are too formulaic. I can't help them until they break that. Writers do that because either they've been mistakenly told they should be doing it, or their alternative is to write a script off of their impulses and instincts. And that doesn't usually end up with a well-structured story. Mm-hmm. So, again, this could be an entire podcast, but organic story structure is understanding the mathematics of storytelling and the tools that are used. And what I do is I will have people read various pilots, various low-budget scripts, very high-budget scripts, and then teach them how to deconstruct the structure to understand how that movie was put together the way it was and why. And when you can understand the mathematics, then you can compose a infinite array of structures. So, as an example, I'll just give one example maybe to kind of concretize this. So in a script, there comes a point where the reader knows these characters, knows what the main story is going to be about, knows what's at stake, and with all of that context, either excitedly gets in the car to go on that journey, or just says, no, thank you, and tosses the script aside and grabs another one. So here's the question. At what point in the script should you launch your story? And the answer is, at least as I would teach it from organic story structure, is as soon as possible. But that depends on how much context you need to get the reader engaged. So if you need 37 pages of context to get the reader engaged, and you launch your story on page 30, you're going to fail. But if you have enough context to get the reader engaged by 7 pages, and you wait until page 15 to launch your story, you're probably going to fail. So that means for each story, there is a mathematically precise answer to where you launch your story. And professional writers, when they work with me, they're always trying to figure out if they have the right launch point. And most non-working writers, they never ask me that because they already know the answer, which is they have to launch their story on page 15 or page 20 or whatever formula or rule that they were taught. So when I used to teach people a paradigm. I used to teach formula. Even though I knew it wasn't true, I taught it because I thought I'd rather people have a formula than no structure, and that people should learn the rules and then they can learn to break the rules. And eventually I realized I was doing them a huge disservice because I wasn't teaching them how to know how much context you need and also I wasn't teaching them, if you have a script like in Bruges or The King's Speech or Babe or The Fighter that has a lot of setup before you launch your movie. How do you keep a reader interested in such a long setup? Or if you have a movie like Juno or The Hurt Locker, where you have you launch your movie really early. How do you keep a reader interested in such a long build section? And so I started teaching people those skill sets, and I saw the success rate, go up exponentially. The problem is too many writers come into this and they've been taught these rules. So this is where you launch your story. This is what happens at the midpoint. Because that's how these 3 movies did it. But those 3 movies did it that way for a reason. And those reasons probably are not the same as for your movie.
Yeah. One of the things I found as a writer with structure, and I mean, I really like the Blake Snyder books, and he's obviously kind of become sort of the main structure. All these templates that you're talking about basically hark back to that. One of the things I found with structure is, when I'm coming up with ideas for scripts, understanding the structure, you can quickly get, and I think this goes back to your compelling cinematic conflict idea, is that, I'll come up with an idea and just loosely putting it into the Blake Snyder template, you can tell quickly that some ideas simply don't have legs, and a good idea it's you don't have to take an idea and mash it in Blake Snyder template. You have an idea, and you can see those points organically. And so I'm able to quickly get rid of ideas and not waste a lot of time working on ideas. And some of the I always go back to something like The Wizard of Oz. It's such a great, it fits all those Blake Snyder beats. And obviously it was written way, way before Blake Snyder, even before Sid Field. So I have to think that there's there's certain ideas that are better movie ideas. And part of that is that they're going to fit the structure. Again, it's not a revisionist thing where you have your idea and then you try and push these square pegs into round holes. It's more of maybe that idea is not a good movie idea.
That makes a lot of sense, but here's the counterpoint. I bring in agents to my UCLA classes, and I have them bring in the scripts that they sign their clients off of. And then I'll ask everyone to read those scripts and say how many of them follow the Blake Snyder rules. Almost none of them do. So there are a lot of ideas out there that you're right, it doesn't fit into that formula. And you have to find an organic way to tell that story, and that creates that pitch perfect, authentic script. So a lot of those ideas that don't fit that recipe, those are the ideas that when you learn how to develop them, gets you those agents, gets you to a TV show like Breaking Bad that didn't fit the paradigm. Mad Men, if you look at the script. Orange and New Black. It doesn't fit these paradigms. They have a unique way of telling their story. So that's the counterpoint to this.
Mm-hmm. And then the counterpoint to that, of course, is I'd be curious to actually look at those scripts and maybe you could actually fit them in, even though at first glance maybe they don't fit the Blake Snyder beat sheet, but then maybe if you looked at them they actually would. So it's an age-old argument.
Well, here's the thing. So the Blake Snyder thing says at the midpoint you've got this false down or false up beat. All you got to do is grab the AFI WGA list of 101 best scripts and just look at those scripts. And anyone who's listening to it can do this and draw their own conclusions. Most of those scripts don't fit that. Most scripts don't actually fit that paradigm. Thank God. And here's another reason, because if they did, they would have outsourced writing to Pakistan so many years ago. So yeah. Now, here's what I would say is if you have an idea and it does fit nicely and by the way, no disrespect to Blake Snyder, but it's basically the hero with 1,000 faces. I mean, that's where all of this comes from. And then and Blake, to his credit, added some things to it, changed some terminology. I'm not saying that he just stole it. He certainly enhanced it. But here's the thing. I would say if you have an idea that does fit nicely into that formula, great. Then why reinvent the wheel if you don't have to? But most ideas don't fit into that. That's the experience of the working writers that I know and the students that I've seen who've gone on to success. Very few of them. Because if you take a script and you write it to that paradigm, then you've written a script that's going to read like everybody else's script who's doing that. And it's hard to stand out that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So anyways, so let's move to the next point. The final skill set that you talk about is rewriting. And, I mean, that's definitely worth mentioning because writing is rewriting.
Sure. Yeah. I think we've already talked about that too. In so much as the way I was trained to do it is The first step is have people read your script. You don't care if they like it. You don't want notes. You don't want feedback. All you want to do is ask people a series of questions to ascertain what experience they're having. What characters are they seeing and why? What's the story? And where are people's experience divergent from the experience you're intending people to have? And the first round of rewriting is to close those gaps until you get to a point where a bunch of people who don't know what you were intending read your script and the experience they have is really close to the experience you're intending. At that point, then you go to step 2, which is what'd you think, what suggestions, like all the kinds of things that people ask up front. Most writers skip that first step. They go straight to the second step. So if you, who obviously are incredibly bright and know a lot about stories, if I haven't done my job and you're a friend of mine and you read my script and you're experiencing a movie and it's not the movie that I intended and you're giving me your really, really smart notes on the movie you experience, it doesn't actually help me in the rewrite because that's not the movie that I'm experiencing. There's a disconnect, but we won't know it. So, I just recently met with a writer, and she had hired some consultants and had a friend in the business, and she said, I got 5 really smart people to read my script and give me feedback, and it was like they read 5 different scripts. And it's true, because she didn't write in very strong conflict, so people were seeing different movies. So, rewriting, I would suggest, is add that first step.
And that's excellent. Just I'm in a writer's group. Often they read their pages and people are ho-hum on pages, and then afterwards they explain what they're going for. And it's like, yeah, write that movie. Write
Exactly.
that movie you just described. So let's talk about a little bit. This was another topic we said we were going to talk about. Let's talk about the current marketplace and kind of what you see as where the marketplace is going and where it's at currently.
In terms of what? Feature TV and
yeah, let's stick to features.
Okay, but specifically, where is it going in terms of what the scripts they're buying?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, that's from what I see is that's a pretty quickly moving target. I mean, I think that the feature business is collapsing. I think that there was a paradigm shift in the 90s when you had consolidation and you had multinational corporations buying all of the studios. Before that, you had studios where it was being run by movie people who love stories, and they had to make a certain number of movies a year just to feed the machine. But now when you're part of this huge multinational corporation and the return on movies is not as good as the return on other parts of the corporation, there's suddenly not such a huge desire to make movies, right? And we experienced that in the writer's strike, because the writer's strike is like, if you don't give us what we want, we're going to just shut this thing down and you're not going to be able to make movies. And they're like, great, we're not sure we want to make movies anyway, go ahead. And they called our bluff. And so they want to make movies that basically are risk-free. They want to make movies that are guaranteed to be successful, movies that are going to have big international appeal, and movies that are based on pre-sold concepts and with stars. And at some point, they realized stars didn't even mean anything in the world of social networking, where word of mouth is instantaneous. It used to be you could put a star. I'm sure I'm saying something you already know, but I'm sorry. Anyway, if you put a star in the old days, you were going to have huge numbers the first week or two before everyone realized the movie was garbage. Now, people know it's garbage before it's released. So stars don't matter as much. So then it was pre-sold concepts, and that's what we see. They're not working either. And it's kind of exciting because basically the model doesn't work and everybody knows it. And so everything's kind of frozen and collapsing in slow motion. And what I see is there are so many screens out there, so many exhibitors. They need product, and they need big product, but they need mid-range product and small product. They need all kinds of movies year round, and they're going to the studio saying, we need more product. And the studios are saying, we don't really care what you want. And so there's now an opportunity, and you're seeing more and more money coming in and creating slates where they can fill the gaps, because you can make movies in a smaller to medium range and you can start pre-selling because the exhibitors are desperate. So we're seeing more, and I don't know the exact numbers in the last couple of weeks, but we were last time I checked on track to have about 3 spec scripts sell every week this year. Last couple of years, it was like 2 spec scripts a week. A couple of years before that, it was 1 spec script a week. So we're certainly seeing more scripts sell, and we're seeing more types of scripts sell. So there's more different kinds of opportunities. Where I think this is going, and this is just one person's opinion, and I could absolutely be wrong, but I think that, 5 years from now, there's going to be more opportunity for writers than there has been in a generation. But it'll be for less pay. Because there'll be more and more narrow distribution channels where you don't need to be chasing outrageous returns. And there's going to be more and more demand for different kinds of stories, for different sensibilities at different levels. Kind of what we've been seeing in TV. I think it's going to move into features. I think there'll be, again, the average writer will make less money. There'll be fewer big 7-figure monster, salaries, but there'll be more product and more opportunity. And I think most writers would take that trade-off. That's my prediction, and I guess also my hope.
Yeah. No, I see the logic to that is as these channels like Netflix, more and there'll be more websites that crop up with, as you say, very niche content, and they will need to feed that. And they're not going for 100 million people. They just need 10,000 people a month basically to subscribe to their service to support them. So no, I think that makes a lot of sense. Whether it's 5 years or 10 years down the road, I agree. I think for most writers, we can only hope for that. So let's talk about your workshops for a minute. Maybe you can just tell us, and maybe if you still do some consulting, you can tell us about that. But when are your classes, and how can people potentially join them?
Okay. So I don't do consulting anymore. I can certainly refer people, but I don't do that anymore. The workshops, then they're sold out for the rest of the year. The next ones will be in January. I do them live in Santa Monica, and I do them online using WebEx, which is like Skype, but it's multi-party. So I have people literally from all over the world take the workshops. If you're interested in getting information, email my assistant, which is lisa@corymandell.net. Or you can email me, which is corey@corymandell.net. My website is corymandell.net. And so we're almost sold out in January. And I don't know when this podcast will actually go live. So if the January is sold out, the next ones will be in March. We generally sell out 4 months in advance usually. Okay. And that's, my website will have more information.
Perfect. Can you tell us just what other classes? Are they one meeting? Are they a series of meetings? How do they work?
Great. So the Professional Screenwriting Workshop is an 8-week workshop, and we meet once a week for 3 hours.
Okay.
So we'll meet 24 hours in total.
Perfect. And is there any sort of qualification? Like, are they geared towards people who have written a few scripts? Are they geared towards newbies? Everything in between, professional writers?
Yeah, great question. So what it does is it teaches people how to write in compelling conflict. It puts a foundation for creative integration and shows people how they can continue that process rewriting. It's designed for people of all levels. We have, in the workshop we're doing right now, we have one who's actually currently staffed and one who's on hiatus, TV writers. We have someone who's with a feature film about to come out. And then we have some people who literally has never written anything in their lives, and everyone in between. I'd say most of the students, the average student, we get a lot of people with MFAs, and we have a lot of people who've probably written 5, 6 scripts. Maybe they had a manager, maybe they didn't, but nothing ever happened for them. And they just feel like there's something missing and they can't put their finger on it. But that said, the workshop, we also get executives. We had the head of HBO for the original programming take it. I'm getting more and more managers take it. So it's cool. We get a cool mix of people.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. You should end the podcast asking you to tell us how people can contact you. You kind of covered that with the website, but maybe you could mention your Twitter handle too. People could find you there.
I'm not really on. I'm on Twitter, but I'm an email guy.
Okay. Email it is. I will link to your website, and I'll put the email address in the show notes so people can find that. They don't have to worry about writing it down. Just find the show notes, and they'll be able to contact you. Well, Corey, this has been a great interview. We covered a lot of great information for screenwriters. So I really appreciate your coming on the show and talking with me.
Thank you so much. I really had fun.
I'm going to be running another online class called How to Write a Killer First Act for Your Screenplay. I'm going to be doing a deep dive into two great screenplays, Unforgiven and Jerry Maguire. These are both great scripts with great first acts, and there's a lot of lessons I'll be pulling out of them. This is the fourth class in this series, which is going to guide you through the entire screenwriting process, from concept to outlining to writing to actually marketing your script and hopefully selling it. If you missed the first three classes, no problem. I recorded them and have put them in the SYS Select forum for you to listen to at your leisure. The class is going to be on Saturday, December 13th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. If you'd like to learn more about this class, go to www.sellingyourscreenplay.com/classes. Also, if you're listening to this after the class has taken place, again, no problem. I will record this class too and put it in the SYS Select forum. In fact, all the classes that have been taught are recorded and are in the forum for SYS Select members to listen to. There's more than a dozen classes in there now. To learn more about SYS Select, just go to www.sellingyourscreenplayselect.com. In the next episode of the Selling Your Screenplay podcast, I'm going to be interviewing writer and director Matt Creed. Matt is a writer and director of an indie film that's coming out in the next couple of weeks called Lily. It's a really nice film. It's a true art house type of film that I know a lot of writers are trying to write. He does a really good job handling a very subtle story, and it's really a very subtle character-driven story. So if you're trying to write this sort of small Sundance type art film, you're not going to want to miss this episode, so keep an eye out for that next week. To wrap things up, I just want to touch on a few things from today's interview with Corey. I've heard people talk about the types of scripts you should be writing to break into the studio system, and I think Corey really articulated it very well, and I think he's just absolutely right. If you want to write at the studio level, you need to write something remarkable and something that's unlike anything else that's out there. Writing something totally original really is your best bet. Now, this isn't really the approach that I take, and it's not really the approach I talk about a lot on the podcast. So one word of caution with this approach: if you try to write something like this, which is to say something totally original, not worrying about typical screenplay structure or really any of the screenplay rules you read about in the books, if you fail, and most people will fail, you'll end up with nothing. It'll be an unproducible mess. However, if you follow the rules, give your story a more traditional structure, and try and write something that's maybe less original but has a clear market, it may not break you into this at the studio level. In fact, I'm sure that it won't, for all the reasons that Corey mentions, but you'll have a much better chance of selling that script to an independent producer like John Suits, who I interviewed on podcast episode number 44. So there's a lot more upside to doing that wholly original screenplay. You know, potentially you can launch your career into the studio level writing. That's a great upside. But there's also a lot less chance that it'll actually hit, because it's going to need to be great for it to actually work. And the question is, can you really write something that's truly great and is going to stand out? Maybe, maybe not. Whereas a tightly structured genre film that might not be nearly as original, it can work even if it's not great. It can be good or even just okay, and you still might be able to find a producer who will make it. So keep this in mind with your strategy. What I've been doing recently and talking about on this podcast, at least in the last few years, is to try and write genre films where I feel like I can find a producer who's interested, even if the script isn't great. I feel like I can find a producer for them if I'm very conscious of other elements like budget and structure and genre. Originality isn't nearly as important in this market, and this seems to basically be working for me. I think for myself, when I was starting out my career, I did worry a lot less about structure and try to write material that was more original, and I didn't find any success with it. What I did find success with is these sorts of independent genre films, so that's the direction I've gone. I keep pushing in that direction because that's where I've had the most success. Now, I think most writers who are still trying to sell their first script, they should be writing lots of different things. I highly recommend that you write something that's exactly like what Corey talks about, something that's totally unique and original and only you can write it. But then also write something that's more traditionally structured, something that could be produced on a smaller budget, something that fits into a more clear genre, and see where you're getting the most traction and then push hard in that direction. As a writer, especially a new writer, you should be writing tons of different stuff and finding your voice and finding sort of what your specialty is. I think to really get a feel for this too, have a look at the scripts that are on the blacklist, either the annual list or even the monthly service, and you'll see the scripts that are successful through it are exactly the types of scripts Corey is talking about, stuff that's really original but not necessarily all that commercial. And then compare that with what the scripts are then compare that to the scripts that are being optioned on a site like Inktip. Those are the genre films that I'm talking about. Less original perhaps, but more commercial. These are mostly genre scripts, probably pretty tightly structured, stuff that can be produced on a reasonable budget. I think the key here is being conscious of what you're trying to do. There's that old saying, the middle of the road is a dangerous place to drive. And I think trying to write something that clearly fits into one of the two camps is your best bet. Go hard in one direction or the other. Write stuff in both different camps, but make sure when you're writing it, you understand where it's going to fall so that you can really push hard in that direction. Write something that's off the wall, totally original, and don't worry about any of those so-called screenwriting rules. Put that script on the blacklist and see how it does. Or if you're more interested in just seeing something you've written get produced at any level, excuse me, be more conscious of structure, genre, and budget, and then use something like Inktip or my email and fax blast service to get it out there and hopefully get it produced. Anyway, that's the show. Thank you for listening.